The rain arrived before anyone in Denver had reason to expect it. Not the soft autumn drizzle that settled over the Front Range in September and made people think of soup and firewood, but the hard, indifferent kind that fell in October, like a judgment cold and sideways and relentless, turning the dirt road outside the property into something closer to a river. Ruth Calloway stood at the edge of the porch she had repainted 4 times in 30 years and watched the water move across her yard carrying loose soil toward the fence line in thin brown ribbons, and she did not go inside. She was 72 years old. She had the posture of a woman who had spent 3 decades on her feet in hospital corridors, shoulders squared, spine straight, despite the slight forward lean that had come with age and long shifts and the particular exhaustion of caring for people who could not care for themselves. Her hands were the most honest part of her. The knuckles were swollen at the joints, the skin across the back of each hand pulled tight and calloused in the specific way that came from 30 years of nursing, followed by 20 more years at a sewing machine. Those hands had held IV lines and surgical scissors and the wrists of patients who were frightened. They had guided a needle through thousands of yards of fabric after the hospital let her go at 60 because her file said her lung capacity had dropped below the threshold the insurance company considered acceptable for floor duty. She had not cried about that either. She had gone home, moved the singer to the kitchen table, and started taking alterations for the neighborhood until the work was steady enough to call it a living. This morning those hands hung at her sides, and she did not reach for anything. The bank's truck had come at 7. 2 men in matching gray jackets, courteous in the practiced way of people paid to be courteous while doing unpleasant work, had begun carrying her life out through the front door with the focused efficiency of a moving company. They had a clipboard. They checked items against a list. The list had been prepared by someone in an office who had never stood in this kitchen, never eaten at this table, never fallen asleep in the room at the back of the house where the window faced east, and the morning light came in at an angle that made everything in the room look briefly amber and warm. To the men with the clipboard, this was a job. The property had been assessed, the debt calculated, the paperwork filed in the proper sequence. They were simply the last step in an administrative process that had begun months earlier when the loan officer at the Denver branch had stamped a folder with a red ink stamp that Ruth had never actually seen but could picture with perfect clarity. The Singer sewing machine came out first. It was a 1952 model, a cabinet Singer with a foot pedal and a cast iron base, and it had belonged to Ruth's grandmother before it had belonged to Ruth. It was not an antique in any sense that would register on the bank's inventory. It was old machinery, functional, worth perhaps $40 at auction. The 2 men carried it between them, one on each end of the cabinet, and Ruth watched them angle it sideways through the door frame and felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived somewhere between the two. That machine had taught her that precise, careful work done at the right speed was the only kind worth doing. Her grandmother had sat at that machine during the Depression and made dresses for other women while her own family wore patched clothes because the work paid and the work was honest, and you did not stop doing honest work simply because you were tired. Ruth placed one hand on the door frame as the men carried it down the porch steps. She held it there for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved her hand away. The rocking chair came next. Harold had built it in 1974 from white oak he had sourced from a mill in Pueblo, sanded it over 4 evenings after his shift at the steelworks, stained it twice with a brush he had cleaned and saved in a coffee tin for exactly this kind of use. He had repaired it 8 times in the 50 years since. The last repair had been 2 years ago after his cardiac event when the doctor had told him to avoid heavy labor, and Harold had instead spent 3 mornings in the garage rewrapping the joints in fresh dowel and wood glue in a particular patience that was the closest thing Harold Calloway had to prayer. The chair went into the truck. Ruth did not watch where they set it. What she watched instead was the man in the gray jacket with the clipboard because he represented something she wanted to understand precisely. He was doing his job. He bore her no personal malice. He had been sent here by a sequence of decisions that had begun in her own family with her own children, and the bank was simply the mechanism through which those decisions had reached their conclusion. She wanted to be clear-eyed about that. She had spent her career in medicine and understood that misplacing your anger, directing it at the delivery rather than the source, was a kind of self-indulgence that cost you clarity, and clarity was the only thing she had left that was entirely her own. The heirloom box she kept. It was a flat cedar box that had once held a set of carving tools belonging to Harold's father, and Ruth had converted it over the years into a container for photographs. A few documents, two small figures the children had made in elementary school from modeling clay, and a lock of hair from each of the 5 births wrapped in separate squares of wax paper labeled in Ruth's handwriting. The man with the clipboard looked at it when she picked it up. She looked back at him, he made a note and moved on. There were things that did not appear on a bank's inventory, and she was grateful that this man seemed to understand which category this particular box occupied. Cooper had not eaten that morning. This was the detail that had told Ruth before the truck arrived, before the paperwork was signed, before any of it became real in the visible world, that today was not a day from which things recovered easily. Cooper was an 11-year-old border collie, black and silver, with one brown eye and one blue eye that gave his face an expression of perpetual attentiveness, as though he were watching two different things at once. He had been with Harold and Ruth since the children were still coming home for holidays, and in 11 years Ruth had never once seen him refuse a meal. That morning she had set his bowl down at 6:30, and he had walked to the door instead and sat there facing the road, and Ruth had understood, in the way that you understood things after 50 years of paying attention to the world around you, that the dog already knew what she had only suspected. Harold sat in the truck. He had been sitting there since 6:45, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket Ruth had tucked around him before she came outside, and from where she stood she could see the slight movement of his chest with each breath. Harold Calloway was 74 years old, a former structural welder who had spent 30 years at Pueblo Steelworks before the plant closed in 1987, and took with it an entire category of men who had built their identities around the particular skill of joining metal under heat. He was a large man who had grown lean in his 70s, and the cardiac event 3 years ago had left him with a heart that worked adequately but required the same careful management you gave a good engine that had been run hard for too long. He did not complain about this. Complaining was not a thing Harold did. He found it inefficient. Cooper rode with Harold. He had climbed into the passenger side of the truck the moment Harold had settled in and pressed his body against the old man's right side and stayed there without moving. And Ruth had watched this from the porch and understood that the dog was doing something more deliberate than seeking warmth. Cooper was keeping Harold occupied so that Ruth could focus on what needed to be focused on, without also managing Harold's need to stand up and do something about what was happening. The men with the clipboard had nearly finished. They were bringing out the last of the furniture that appeared on the inventory: a side table, a floor lamp, a set of shelves Harold had built for the hallway, when the first vehicle appeared at the end of the road. Not a bank vehicle, a late model sedan, dark blue clean, despite the mud of the road, driven with the careful distance management of someone who understood exactly where to position wheels to avoid the worst of the soft ground. Ruth had watched that road for 40 years and knew every driver by their relationship to it. Robert had always known where to put his tires. Her oldest son stepped out of the car in a brown wool sweater and leather boots that were waterproofed and well-maintained and had clearly never been worn in a forge or a field. He was 53 years old and carried himself with the particular uprightness of a man who had decided early that appearance was a form of argument. He held a leather folder under one arm. He walked toward Ruth with the measured pace of someone who had rehearsed this approach and was executing it at the agreed-upon tempo. Ruth watched him come. She did not move from the porch. Robert stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at her. His expression was the expression of a doctor delivering a diagnosis he believed was necessary, but unfortunate, professionally compassionate, internally resolved. "Mom," he set the leather folder under his arm more securely. "I've already spoken with the Sisters of Mercy home in Colorado Springs. They have a unit for respiratory conditions. 2 nurses on overnight rotation. Good food. Private rooms." Ruth let the silence hold for a moment. In her experience, silence was one of the most useful diagnostic tools available to anyone who knew how to use it. People filled silence with what they were actually thinking. Robert filled it. The intake coordinator said they see cases like Dad's frequently. They can manage his cardiac monitoring without you having to. What happens to Cooper? It was not a question. Ruth's voice, when she chose to use it, was low and steady, the voice of a woman who had spent 3 decades telling frightened people the truth clearly enough that they could hear it. Robert's pause was brief but precise. They don't permit animals. The words settled into the rain noise around them. From the truck, Ruth heard Harold shift his weight, the specific sound of the suspension adjusting under a man who had just heard something that required him to decide whether to move. Cooper beside Harold made no sound at all. Ruth looked at her son. Not at the folder or the boots or the expression he had prepared. She looked at the specific quality of his stillness, the way his hands gripped the folder a fraction tighter than the conversation required. Robert had been a sharp child. He had learned to calculate outcomes before he committed to a position. That had made him useful in business and had made him over a long marriage to a woman Ruth had always found difficult to read, a man who treated every conversation as a transaction to be structured in his favor. You took out the second mortgage on this house 6 years ago for the restaurant. Ruth did not raise her voice. Your father and I co-signed because you were our son and you were starting over after the first place closed, and we believed in starting over. We still believe in it. She paused. But I want you to hear me say clearly what happened, because I have noticed that clear language is something you have spent some effort avoiding this morning. Robert opened his mouth. We gave you the means to save your business. Your sister spent 4 years of your father's wages on her law school debt because we didn't want her starting her career buried. Your brother borrowed against our retirement account 3 times, and we never once changed the locks or the phone number. We did those things because we are your parents, and that is what parents do. Ruth's hands were still at her sides. And now you are standing at the bottom of my porch steps telling me the price of the room you found for us is the dough. Robert's face shifted. Mom, I'm trying to be practical. You can keep your practicality. The words came out quiet and final, the way a door closes when the person closing it is certain they will not open it again today. Cooper goes where we go. That is not a negotiation. The second car arrived 15 minutes later. Catherine in her practical sedan, a thick folder of papers on the passenger seat that Ruth could see through the window. Her daughter was 49 years old and had the analytical intelligence of someone who had decided early that emotion was a variable you isolated and controlled rather than a force you worked with. She was not cruel. Ruth had never believed Catherine was cruel. She was a person who had learned that the cleanest version of any situation was the version rendered in paperwork, and she had brought paperwork, and the paperwork had been prepared in advance, which meant the decisions encoded in it had been made before anyone drove up this road today. Daniel came on foot from a car parked at the road's edge, hands in the pockets of his jacket, eyes moving slightly to the left of center, in the way they moved when he was calculating the distances between things, the door, the truck, his mother, the easiest available exit. He was 46 and had the face of a man who had spent years doing the wrong thing and was not at peace with it, but had not yet discovered the specific sequence of events that would change that. He stood in the yard and did not approach. Margaret arrived last, her car parking too close to the fence, and she was already crying before she was fully out of the vehicle. She was 43 and the youngest of the 5, and her grief was immediate and visible in the way that only the grief of people who had not yet learned to manage it could be. Ruth looked at her youngest daughter and felt something complicated move through her, not pity exactly, but recognition. Margaret felt everything before she understood it. That was not a weakness in the way the world usually described it. It was just a different sequence of arriving at the truth. The bank's men finished loading. The truck's engine turned over with a sound that Ruth had been half listening for, without knowing it, and the vehicle reversed down the muddy road and turned north. Ruth watched it go. She did not catalog what was on it. She knew what was on it. Cataloging it served no purpose. Robert held out a ring of keys. They were old 3 keys on a plain steel ring, orange with rust at the teeth. He held them with 2 fingers slightly extended in the way you held something you expected the other person to take quickly. There's property in the mountains, Grandfather Harold's grandmother's old mining claim up near Silver Creek. The cabin might still be standing. He paused and his eyes moved briefly toward the truck where Harold sat. It's up in the Rockies, hard country in winter. Ruth looked at the keys, then she looked at Robert's face, and she caught it a thing so brief and controlled that any other person in any other emotional state might have missed it entirely. A flicker at the left corner of his mouth. Not a smile of pleasure. Something cooler and more deliberate than that. The expression of a man who had just handed over a problem and was watching to confirm the transfer was complete. Ruth reached out and took the keys. She felt their weight heavier than three small pieces of rusted metal had any reason to be, and closed her fingers around them and held them in her fist and did not look at Robert again. She looked instead at the line of the mountains, dark gray and white above the brown plains, and she thought about a ring of rusted keys and a man's controlled expression and the specific logic of a gift offered by someone who knows its value and is counting on you not to know it yet. She did not say any of what she was thinking. She turned and walked to the truck and climbed up into the driver's seat. Harold turned his head and looked at the keys in her hand. "Cooper comes," Harold said. It was not a question. It was a man confirming a fact he already knew was true. Ruth set the keys on the dash between them. Cooper lifted his gray muzzle toward her briefly, then settled it back against Harold's arm. "We'll need the hardware store before we leave Denver," Ruth said. "Rope, a utility knife, nails. Whatever they have in weatherproofing tape. We'll need the thermos filled and the medicine bag packed." Harold looked at her for a long moment. In 50 years of marriage, he had learned to read the specific frequency of her silences, and this one told him that she had seen something she was not yet ready to speak aloud. "What is it?" "Nothing we can fix from here." Ruth turned the key in the ignition. "Get comfortable. The drive takes 2 days." The road out of Denver toward the mountains climbed gradually, at first the city giving way to suburb, and suburb giving way to open land, in the slow, reluctant way of cities that know they are being left. Ruth drove. Harold slept for the first 2 hours, and Cooper sat between them with his muzzle lifted slightly toward the crack in the window, reading the air, the way dogs read it, not passively, but with the focused engagement of a creature for whom information arrived primarily through the nose and was treated with the seriousness it deserved. The mountains appeared in stages. First as a suggestion of dark mass at the horizon, then as a definite presence, then as the specific and demanding geography of the Rocky Mountain front ridgeline, after ridgeline rising in the gray October light, like the spines of something ancient and indifferent to human schedules. Ruth had driven this road before Harold had taken her once to Colorado Springs years ago for their anniversary, and she had driven the mountain highways twice for work-related training in her nursing years. But the road she was on now went north of that familiar route and climbed higher and narrower with every mile, and the familiar landmarks disappeared and were replaced by rock faces and pine stands and the occasional pull-off where a truck had stopped and left tire tracks pressed into the soft shoulder. Harold woke when the grade steepened. He looked out the window at the terrain and then at the elevation indicator on the dash and then at Ruth's hands on the wheel. His hands had the breadth and the roughness of a man who had worked with them his entire adult life. The palms widened from years of gripping steel tools, the fingertips calloused in a pattern she knew as well as she knew her own reflection. She had held those hands in the hospital 3 years ago when the cardiac event had resolved itself into a diagnosis and a prognosis and a set of instructions for managing the rest of his life with an organ that had given its full measure and was now working on something closer to goodwill. "Are you counting?" Harold asked. Ruth understood immediately. He meant his breaths. He had noticed her noticing. 14, she said. "Normal." Harold nodded and looked out of the window again. The sky had cleared above the tree line, and the light that came down through it had the particular quality of high-altitude light in October bright, without warmth, the kind of light that illuminated everything with precision, but offered nothing in the way of comfort. A hawk moved along a ridge to the east, riding something thermal, barely moving its wings. Harold's voice was quiet when it came. "She never told us much about the cabin, Clara." Ruth had been waiting for him to begin this. She had been thinking about the journal entry, not the actual entry, because she had not yet read it, would not read it until she found it, but the concept of it, the idea that there was a woman somewhere in the history of Harold's family who had known this place and chosen to stay in it. Harold had mentioned Clara Whitmore exactly once in their marriage in passing during a conversation about family history that had wandered sideways the way those conversations did when the children were small and everyone was tired and the sentences came out incomplete. "You said she stayed on the mountain after her husband died." "My father said she was strange." Harold watched the hawk disappear behind the ridge. "The family word for a woman who did something they didn't understand was always strange." "I don't think she was strange. I think she knew something." Cooper lifted his head suddenly. His ears moved forward and then slightly to the right, tracking something in the trees at the road's edge that Ruth could not see or hear. His body did not tense into alarm. He was simply noting something, filing it, returning to a neutral state of watchfulness. Ruth had observed this behavior enough times in the past 11 years to understand that it was not random. Cooper did not respond to stimuli he considered irrelevant. If he moved his ears, there was something worth noting. The road continued to climb. On the afternoon of the first day, they stopped at a small town with a hardware store and a gas station and a diner where Ruth ordered coffee and Harold ordered soup, and Cooper waited in the truck and received a portion of Ruth's eggs when she brought them back wrapped in a napkin. Ruth bought rope and nails and weatherproofing tape and a box of matches and a second flashlight and a wool blanket from a bin near the register that was marked $2.50. The woman at the register was 60 years old and had the settled face of a person who had stopped being surprised by what people bought at hardware stores before long mountain winters. That night, they slept in the truck, parked at a rest area above the 7,000-foot line, and the temperature dropped to 23 degrees, and the truck's heater cycled on and off through the night, and Cooper's warmth between them was the steady metabolic warmth of an animal operating at peak biological efficiency, which was considerably more reliable than the heater. Ruth woke 3 times. Each time, Harold's breathing was steady and measured. Each time, Cooper was already awake, sitting upright in the dark, looking out the frost-edged windshield at whatever the night contained. The second morning brought clear skies and the particular cold that lived above 8,000 feet. A cold that was not aggressive, the way the Denver cold was aggressive, but simply present the way altitude was simply present, a fact of the landscape that did not ask your opinion. Ruth drove. The trees changed character as the road climbed the scrub oak and cottonwood of the lower elevations, giving way to ponderosa pine, and then to the denser, darker stands of Engelmann spruce that grew at the high elevations, where the soil was thin and the seasons were compressed, and the trees grew slowly over very long periods of time and were consequently harder than anything that had grown fast. She thought about Harold's grandmother. She had never been a woman inclined toward mysticism, and she was not inclined toward it now, but she was a woman who took evidence seriously, and the evidence of her own life suggested that the things you dismissed as coincidence or sentiment were sometimes the things that carried the most functional information. A woman who had survived alone at altitude for 20 years had developed knowledge. That knowledge had been organized into a structure, a cabin, a cellar, a preserved set of tools, and that structure had waited. Ruth did not need that to be miraculous. She needed it to be true. The trail turned northeast at a fork marked with a rusted sign she nearly missed. The pavement ended. The truck's tires moved onto packed dirt and gravel, and then simply onto 2 tracks pressed into the mountain soil by whatever vehicles had come this way before, and the trees closed in on both sides close enough that the branch ends scraped the truck's mirrors with a sound like fingernails on slate. Cooper stood up on the seat. Not alarm mobilization, the same focused posture she had seen him take when they arrived at new places that required assessment. His nose was working steadily, and his eyes moved between the windshield and the side window with the systematic coverage of an animal doing a job. Harold watched the dog for a moment. He's done this before. Ruth kept her eyes on the track. He's never been above Denver. Harold's voice carried something that was almost amusement, almost something older than amusement. I didn't say this time. The track crested a ridge and Ruth stopped the truck. Below them in a hollow formed by the convergence of 2 mountain flanks sat the remains of Silver Creek. She could see where the settlement had been the stone foundations arranged in a rough grid that suggested a community that had once had enough people to organize itself around streets, however informal. The mining infrastructure was evident: rusted cable drums, the collapsed frame of a processing shed, what appeared to be the entrance to a horizontal shaft cut into the eastern slope and now sealed with decades of rockfall and pine growth. 3 wooden buildings had survived long enough to develop the particular aesthetic of structures that have been left to the mountain. They leaned in different directions, their window openings dark, their roofs in varying states of return to the ground. The cabin stood in the approximate center of the clearing. Half of its roof had collapsed inwards, the fallen section visible as a dark depression from this distance. The chimney leaned away from the east wall at an angle that suggested it was held in place more by habit than by mortar. The door, Ruth could see this even from the ridge, was open, hanging from what appeared to be a single hinge moving slightly in the wind that moved through the hollow. Harold's breath went in and came out slowly. Ruth put the truck in gear and took it down the slope. Closer, the damage was comprehensive in the way damage was comprehensive when it had been accumulating for decades without any counterpressure from human maintenance. The porch boards had rotted through in two places. The window frames had lost their glass, and the openings had been colonized by whatever small animals and birds had needed shelter at various points in the intervening years. The interior, visible through the open door, had the quality of a space that had ceased being a room and become instead an environment, the floor uneven from moisture and freeze. Thaw cycles, animal tracks crossing the dust in multiple directions, a rusted iron stove on its side against the near wall. Ruth sat in the truck for a moment. She looked at the cabin, she looked at the collapsed roof section and the leaning chimney and the floor she could already see would need to be tested before it bore weight. She was not overwhelmed, she was assessing. The difference between those two states was not emotional, but operational. Despair asked what had been lost. Assessment asked what remained functional and what could be restored to function given available materials and time. The roof would need attention before the first snow. The chimney could be remortared if the foundation stones were sound. The floor could be replaced board by board. The door needed a second hinge and would need to be rehung level. The walls appeared structurally intact from the outside, which was the thing that mattered most, because walls were the frame on which everything else hung. She climbed out of the truck. The cold air hit the back of her throat and she felt her lungs contract slightly, the way they contracted at altitude, the automatic response of airways that had been damaged by years of the particular inflammation that COPD produced. She breathed out slowly and breathed in again, and the tightness moderated. The air here was cleaner than Denver air, in a way that was not atmospheric poetry, but a literal reduction in the particulate load that Denver's altitude and traffic and industrial history had added to every breath she had taken for 40 years. Cooper was out of the truck before she had taken 3 steps. He did not follow her toward the cabin. He moved in a wide arc around the clearing's perimeter, nose low pace, steady and deliberate, checking the tree line in segments and doubling back along the creek bed that ran along the northern edge of the clearing. He was not anxious. He was thorough. Ruth had always understood, at the level of practical observation, that Cooper's intelligence operated along lines that were not the same as human intelligence, but were not lesser than it. They were simply organized around different information and optimized for different outcomes. Harold stood beside the truck. He moved slowly on the uneven ground, one hand on the truck's side for reference, as he came around to where Ruth stood. He looked at the cabin for a long time. Ruth stepped through the doorway first. The interior was cold in the way that enclosed spaces that had not held heat in years were cold, a deeper cold than the outdoor air, as if the structure had stored the low temperatures of multiple winters in its walls. She stood on the threshold and let her eyes adjust, and then moved forward, carefully testing each floorboard before committing weight to it. The boards near the east wall were compromised. She could hear the hollow sound beneath them that indicated rot from below. The boards near the west wall were better. Near the stove, which had been set on a stone foundation, the floor was solid. She righted the stove with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, and her arms shook slightly with the effort, but it came upright and settled onto its base, and she straightened and stood looking at it. The flue pipe was missing. The firebox door was intact. The cast iron, while rusted, was structurally sound. She had seen nurses work with worse. Harold appeared in the doorway. Ruth looked around the room. She looked at the collapsed section of roof through which the gray sky was visible. She looked at the animal tracks in the dust and the rusted cans in the corner and the broken shelving on the north wall. The west wall is solid. Her voice was measured, not reassuring because she was not performing optimism, but reporting an assessment. The stove can be made functional if we find the right flue section. The floor needs work, but it can be done in sections. The roof is the priority. Harold leaned against the doorframe. Most people would look at this and think it was the end. She looked at her husband. Most people would be wrong. He smiled, not the bright smile he had given the children when they were small and needed to be convinced that the world was manageable, but the older smile, the one that lived in the lines around his eyes and knew that the world was not manageable and loved it anyway. "No," he said. "I know that. I've known that since 1971. Ruth moved to the window opening and looked out at the clearing. Cooper had finished his circuit of the perimeter and was now standing at the northern edge of the clearing, approximately 30 feet from the creek bed, looking at a slight rise in the ground that was covered with a uniform layer of pine needles and the early accumulation of snow from the previous week. He was not digging. He was standing with the particular focused stillness of an animal that had located something and was waiting for permission to proceed. "What is he doing?" Harold had moved to stand beside Ruth. She studied the dog's posture, the way his weight was distributed slightly forward, the way his eyes did not move from the specific patch of ground he had selected. He found something. Harold looked at Cooper and then at the ground where the dog stood. "What? I don't know yet." Ruth turned back to the room. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to angle lower through the trees, and the temperature was dropping in the specific incremental way it dropped at high altitude when the direct sun left the hollow. They had perhaps 2 hours before the cold became a different kind of problem. She began calculating fire warmth, the truck's remaining fuel, the food in the cooler in the truck bed, the blankets, Harold's medication schedule. Cooper barked once. It was not the bark of a dog encountering something threatening. It was a single clear note directed at Ruth, carrying the precise communicative intention of a sound made by an animal that understood it was communicating and had chosen its message carefully. Ruth set down the weatherproofing tape she had been examining. She looked at Harold. Harold raised his eyebrows once in the expression that meant, in their private vocabulary, "I think you should go look." She walked back out through the door and across the clearing to where Cooper stood. The pine needles on the rise were not randomly distributed. She saw this when she stood close enough. They were distributed in the specific pattern of needles that had fallen over a structure rather than onto flat ground, accumulating at the edges and thinning at the center, the way snow accumulated differently over solid wood than over open earth. Ruth crouched. She brushed a section of needles aside with her forearm. Under them, old wood, weathered gray, fitted against a stone surround with the careful joinery of someone who had built this to last. A door, set into the ground. A cellar door. Ruth sat back on her heels for a moment. The cold was in her knees and the light was continuing to decline, and behind her she could hear Harold's footsteps coming across the clearing. She placed both hands flat on the wood of the door and felt the grain of it, hardwood old, but structurally intact, the grain, tight in the way that wood was tight when it had dried slowly over many decades and achieved a density that newer lumber couldn't approach. She found the handle recessed into a notch cut in the wood for exactly this purpose. She pulled. The door did not move. She shifted her weight and pulled again from a lower angle using her back rather than her arms, and the door resisted and then gave the hinges, grinding through rust and dried pine sap with a sound like something that had been asleep for a very long time being asked to wake. She looked down into the space below. Harold arrived beside her and crouched down with a hand on her shoulder and looked into the opening alongside her. Ruth clicked on the flashlight. The cellar was dry. The stone walls were fitted without mortar, dry stack construction. Each stone selected and placed for its fit with its neighbors rather than held in place by anything that could crack or crumble. The shelves were built into the walls, deep shelves of the same close-grained hardwood as the door, and they held things. Ruth moved the flashlight across them slowly. Canning jars, dozens of them sealed with wax, dried goods in cloth bags tied at the necks. Firewood stacked against the back wall in a quantity that someone had calculated with the specific arithmetic of survival. Not the casual pile of someone who had gathered more than they expected to need, but the organized, measured stock of someone who had determined exactly how many cords would be necessary and had provided precisely that. Tools hung on wooden pegs along the east wall. Axes, a handsaw, a set of chisels, a draw knife, and adze. Each one hung at a height and spacing that suggested the person who had put them there had thought about reach and efficiency in the specific order in which these tools would likely be needed. And on the lowest shelf at the back against the stone of the rear wall, something that was not food or firewood or tools. Ruth moved the beam to it, a flat object roughly 8 inches by 10, wrapped in oilcloth that had been tied closed with a leather cord, and carved into the stone of the wall directly above the shelf in letters that had been worked carefully into the rock with a pointed tool over what must have been considerable time. C. W. Ruth looked at those 2 letters for a long moment. The flashlight beam held steady on them. Behind her, she heard Harold's breath change, not alarm, not the change she counted and measured, but the breath of a man who had heard something he recognized despite never having heard it before. "Clara Whitmore," he said. His voice was quiet in the way that voices went quiet in places where something important had happened a long time ago. Ruth set the flashlight on the edge of the opening and lowered herself into the cellar. Her knees protested and her lungs tightened at the shift from the thin outdoor air to the enclosed air of the space, but she breathed out and steadied and reached for the oilcloth-wrapped object on the shelf. She untied the leather cord. The oilcloth folded back stiffly, revealing the cover of a journal. Dark leather worn smooth at the edges from handling the cover blank, except for two letters stamped into it in the same careful hand that had carved the initials in the stone. Sibo. Ruth held it for a moment. The weight of it was not the weight of the paper and the leather. It was the weight of time and intention of a thing made to be found. Cooper appeared at the opening above her, looking down. His expression, if a dog could be said to have an expression, was one of patient completion of an animal that has done the task it was doing and is now ready for whatever comes next. Ruth climbed back out of the cellar with the journal under her arm and stood on the cold ground of Silver Creek Hollow in the last of the afternoon light and looked at Harold. He was watching her. He had the specific quality of attention he gave to things he considered important, not the polite attention he gave to things he could hear clearly. This was the narrowed, full-presence attention of a man deciding what something meant. She knew someone would come, Ruth said. It was not a conclusion presented for agreement. It was an observation she was filing. Harold looked at the two initials carved into the wall of the open cellar. She knew someone would need to. Above them, the first evening stars appeared at the dark margin of the sky, where the ridge met the air, and the temperature dropped another 3 degrees, and somewhere up the slope behind the cabin, the sound of moving water reached them. Not the creek which ran north and lower, but something warmer. Something that produced a faint mist where its water met the cooling air. Something neither of them had noticed yet and would not find until morning. That night they slept, in the truck, again the journal on the dash between the keys and the flashlight. Cooper in his place between them, the hollow around them, dark and quiet, in the particular way that high mountain places were quiet, not silent, but full of sounds that had nothing to do with human schedules or human troubles, and therefore provided a kind of rest that the city with its ambient noise of other people's urgencies had never offered. Ruth had set the journal within reach deliberately. But the cabin had no heat yet, and no light adequate for reading, and what Clara Whitmore had written across decades deserved better than a flashlight beam in a cold truck cab. It would wait until the stove was running and the room was warm enough to sit in without the cold competing for attention. Some things were worth the patience of proper conditions. Ruth woke at 2:15. She knew the time without looking, because she had always known the time within 15 minutes of accuracy when she woke in the night, a skill acquired from years of hospital shifts, where the difference between 2 and 3 in the morning was the difference between one set of tasks and another. She was awake, and then she was fully awake, the abrupt transition that meant something had changed in the information available to her senses. Cooper was not between them. The dog was sitting upright on Harold's side of the bench seat, and he was licking Harold's hand in a steady, rhythmic way that was not affectionate, that was purposeful, the way an animal applied stimulus to trigger response. Harold's eyes were closed, his chest moved. She counted 22 breaths per minute. She put 2 fingers against the pulse point below his jaw and counted for 30 seconds and multiplied. 94, elevated but not critical. The rhythm was irregular in the specific way it had been irregular on the afternoon of his cardiac event, not the dangerous arrhythmia, but the precursor pattern, the one the cardiologist had described as a warning that the system was under load. The mountain air was thin. The cold had been more severe than the forecast she had checked in Denver had indicated. Harold had not mentioned discomfort before sleeping, which was either good news or was Harold being Harold, which amounted to the same thing. Ruth reached into the medicine bag without turning on the light by feel because she had packed it herself and knew exactly where every item was. Heparin, 1 regular strength tablet, the preventive dose, not the intervention dose. She was not at intervention yet. She put it in Harold's hand and closed his fingers around it and said his name once quietly. He stirred. He opened his eyes and looked at her in the dark with the recognition of a man who knew exactly where he was and approximately what was happening. "Take it," Ruth said. He did. She watched him. Cooper remained pressed against his side, a living warmth with a pulse. The wind moved through the hollow outside the truck, and the pine trees absorbed it and gave back a lower, longer sound, and the stars through the windshield were the hard, brilliant stars of altitude, no atmosphere to soften them, each one as clear and fixed as a surgical lamp. Harold's pulse settled toward 88 over the next 40 minutes. His breathing rate came down to 17. Ruth did not sleep again. She sat in the dark with her hands in her lap and counted his breaths and watched the stars through the windshield and thought about the journal on the dash and the tools on the cellar walls and the two letters carved in stone and the specific expression on Robert's face when he had handed her these keys. She thought about a woman named Clara Whitmore who had come to this place and been called strange for staying and had nevertheless stayed and had not wasted her time here on grief, but had built a hinge, a shelf, a door, an inventory of what was needed, and the patience to provide it. The mountain did not know she was here. The stars did not care. The cold continued without reference to her situation. None of that was the point. The point was that her hands were in her lap, and Harold was breathing, and Cooper was at his side, and the hollow around them had sheltered people before and could shelter people again. And when the light came back in a few hours, she would climb down from this truck and start doing the first thing that needed doing, and then the second, and then the third. Across the dash, the rusted keys lay still. Cooper lifted his head in the dark and looked out the windshield toward the slope above the cabin. His ears moved forward. He held the position for 3 seconds, read whatever he read, and lowered his head back against Harold's arm. Ruth watched the direction the dog had looked. The slope was dark. The trees were dark. But there was something above them. She could not hear it and could not see it, but she felt it the way you felt the presence of a door you hadn't opened yet, a room whose contents were unknown, but whose existence was certain. Something warm on this cold mountain. Something that had been here for a long time waiting to be useful. Morning, she thought. One thing at a time. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sky above the eastern ridge lightened in gradations black to charcoal to the particular gray-blue that existed for perhaps 20 minutes before the sun cleared the mountain and announced itself fully, and Ruth sat in the same position she had occupied for the last 4 hours, hands in her lap, back against the seat, counting. Harold's breathing had stabilized at 15 per minute somewhere around 4 in the morning. His pulse, when she checked it again at 5:30, had returned to the rhythm she knew as his own, not textbook, but Harold's, the cadence she had learned the way you learned a piece of music you intended to keep. When Harold opened his eyes at 6:15, he looked first at the windshield, then at Cooper, then at Ruth. He assessed the situation in the specific order that told her he was fully himself, the world, then the animal, then the person he trusted most. His color was better. The gray undertone that had been in his skin at 2 in the morning had receded. His voice was low and steady. I worried you. Ruth met his eyes. You did. She did not soften it. They had agreed years ago that the kindest thing they could do for each other was to be accurate. Your heart ran irregularly for about 90 minutes. It self-corrected. The aspirin helped. She paused. And Cooper helped. Harold looked at the dog beside him. His large, calloused hand moved to the dog's neck and rested there. Cooper's tail moved once a single arc, accepting the acknowledgement without requiring more of it. Outside the hollow was quiet in the way it had been quiet all night. The deep, structural quiet of a place that had not been regularly disturbed by human noise for decades and had reorganized itself around a different acoustic reality. A Stellar's jay called twice from the ponderosa stand at the clearing's edge. The creek moved steadily along its northern course. The cabin stood where it had stood, unchanged by the night's events, indifferent and patient. Ruth climbed out of the truck. The cold hit the back of her throat immediately, and her lungs registered it the way they registered all air now, as a substance to be evaluated before it was fully admitted. This air was thin and clean in equal measure. She breathed out slowly and breathed in again, and the familiar tightening moderated faster than it had at any point in Denver, which was an observation she filed without drawing a conclusion from yet. Cooper followed her out. He stretched once a long, deliberate extension that started at his front legs and ran through the length of his body, and then he turned toward the slope above the cabin and stood still. Ruth looked at the slope. In the morning light, it revealed details that the afternoon's failing light had not shown clearly, the way the terrain rose at a manageable grade for perhaps 60 feet before steepening the presence of a narrow line through the undergrowth that was not a maintained trail, but was a consistent thinning of the brush that suggested repeated passage. Something or someone had moved along that line regularly enough to shape the vegetation, and that kind of shaping took either a large number of years or a large number of individual trips, and in either case it meant there was something at the top worth going toward. Cooper looked at her over his shoulder with both eyes, the brown and the blue, and then turned back to the slope and waited. She told Harold she would be back within the hour. She told him to stay in the truck until he felt warm enough to move without effort. She told him this in the specific tone she had developed over 50 years for communicating non-negotiable information in a way that did not invite the negotiation that was Harold's natural response to anything he considered an instruction. He received it with the expression of a man who understood that this was one of the areas in which her authority was final and practical, rather than symbolic, and he nodded and accepted the thermos she handed him and did not get out of the truck. The climb took 35 minutes. Ruth moved carefully on the uneven ground, testing her footing before each step, which was not caution in the emotional sense, but accuracy in the physical sense. She understood her body's current parameters and worked within them rather than against them. The cold air continued to be easier than Denver air, and this registered in her chest as something she noted and did not yet explain. Cooper moved ahead of her on the narrow line through the brush, stopping at intervals to look back and confirm her progress, and she understood that he had made this specific trip before during his night watch, and was now guiding rather than exploring. The hot spring announced itself first as a warmth in the air that was inconsistent with the surrounding temperature, a differential of perhaps 15 degrees felt against the exposed skin of her face. Then as a sound just below the threshold of what she would call audible, more like a pressure in the air than a noise. Then as she stepped through the last of the pine growth onto the smooth granite bench that rimmed it as the thing itself. The pool was roughly 12 feet across, roughly circular, set into the granite, in a natural depression that suggested the water had found this path over a very long time and had shaped the stone around it through the pure persistence of flow. The water was clear and the color of pale jade where it was deepest at the center, and steam rose from it in thin, twisting columns that caught the new morning light and held it briefly before dispersing. Snow covered the surrounding granite to within 18 inches of the water's edge, and the line between the snow and the bare rock told its own story. The heat of the water maintained a thermal perimeter that the cold could not cross. Ruth crouched at the edge and held her hand above the surface. The warmth that came up was not the aggressive heat of a man-made hot tub, but the moderate mineral-laden warmth of water that had traveled through deep rock and arrived at the surface carrying the chemistry of its passage. She could smell its sulfur, faint but unmistakable, and beneath that, something else, a mineral complexity that she associated with the kind of water that had been used therapeutically in the mountain sanatoriums of the previous century, the places where people with respiratory conditions had gone before the antibiotics era made such treatments seem primitive. She lowered herself to sit on the dry granite beside the edge and put her feet in. The warmth moved up through her ankles and into her feet and then traveled along her legs in the specific way that deep warmth traveled, reaching places that had been cold since October. And something else, the steam rising from the surface, entered her breathing space, and her airways, the compromised, thickened airways of a woman with moderate COPD who had spent 2 days at high altitude in cold air, responded to that warm, humid mineral air with a relaxation she had not expected. It was not a cure. Ruth Calloway did not believe in cures for structural damage. She believed in management and in the honest assessment of what any given intervention could and could not achieve. What this steam and this warmth were doing was what a well-designed nebulizer treatment did, warming and humidifying the airway passages, reducing the chronic low-level inflammation that was the proximate cause of her daily breathlessness, dilating the bronchial passages through the combined action of heat and the magnesium sulfate compounds she could smell in the water. She breathed in slowly through her nose and out through her mouth, the way the pulmonologist in Denver had taught her, and with the steam doing the work that the dry, cold air outside could not do, each breath went deeper than the last. Cooper sat beside her. He had the satisfied posture of an animal who had accomplished the thing he set out to accomplish and was now simply present, which was its own form of accomplishment. Ruth sat by the water for a long time. She was not resting. She was calculating the distance from the cabin to the pool, the time required daily for therapeutic use to produce measurable benefit. What measurable benefit might look like in practical terms for a 72-year-old woman with moderate obstructive lung disease? She was also beneath the calculation, doing something less systematic. She was sitting in a place that a woman named Clara Whitmore had sat before her and feeling the specific quality of that continuity. Not sentimental, not mystical, simply the recognition that some things worked and had always worked and did not require rediscovery in each generation so much as they required the willingness to return to them. Getting Harold up here would require planning. The grade was manageable, but the footing was uneven, and Harold's cardiac restrictions meant that any exertion needed to be gradual and monitored. She would need to improve the path first. She would need to test his tolerance for the climb and stages before she let him attempt the full ascent. She would need to find a way to make the pool accessible without the 60-foot approach becoming the primary obstacle. She was still making that calculation when she heard Harold's voice below her calling her name with the specific frequency he used when he needed to know her location, rather than needing help, the information call, rather than the distress call. She had learned the difference between those two frequencies in their first year of marriage and had never confused them since. She called back. Within 10 minutes, he appeared through the pine growth, moving carefully, one hand braced against the larger tree trunks as he passed them. His face when he stepped onto the granite bench and saw the pool went through a sequence of expressions that ended in the one Ruth recognized as Harold encountering something that confirmed a thing he had already half understood. He sat down beside her. He put his feet in the water without being invited to and made no sound about it, which meant it was what he had expected. My father said she found warmth on the mountain. His voice was quiet. He thought she meant she found peace. He thought that was a metaphor. Ruth looked at the steam rising from the water into the cold morning air. Sometimes practical people use metaphors because the literal truth sounds too convenient. Harold leaned back on his hands on the granite and looked at the sky, which had gone from the pale blue of early morning to the deeper, more definite blue that the Rocky Mountain sky became when the sun was fully up and there was no cloud interference. She was here every morning. The journal. We haven't read it yet. I know, but she was. He said it with the calm certainty of a man who had decided to trust a feeling because the feeling had so far proven more accurate than the alternatives. I can tell by how the path is worn. Someone made that path on purpose, made it usable. Ruth pulled her feet from the water and put her boots back on. The warmth in her airways was already fading toward the baseline, which told her that the benefit was real, but the application needed to be regular to be cumulative. We'll come back this afternoon, both of us, and we'll read the journal tonight when the cabin is warm enough to sit in. Harold smiled at that, the small smile that meant he had heard the plan, that the plan was good, and that he knew she had already decided it before she said it aloud. He got to his feet without difficulty, which was better than the previous day, which was itself a data point she filed. They went back down the slope together and began the work. The first task was the stove. Without heat, the cabin could not be occupied, and without occupancy, the cabin remained the mountain's property rather than theirs. Ruth had found a section of flue pipe in the cellar, not a perfect fit for the existing collar, but close enough to be made serviceable with the weatherproofing tape and 2 hose clamps she had bought at the hardware store in the small town below. Harold made the connection while Ruth cleared the firebox of the debris that had accumulated in the stovepipe above a compacted mass of old bird nesting material, dried pine needles, and the remnants of what had once been a substantial paper wasp colony. She used a length of wire from the tool supply in the cellar and cleared it section by section, working from the clean end toward the blocked end so that the debris fell into the firebox rather than back into the room. The first fire took 3 attempts. The flue needed to warm before it drew properly, and the wood from the cellar dry and well seasoned as it was produced smoke that found its way into the room through the imperfect connection at the collar until the draw established itself. Ruth stood in the smoke for the first few minutes because there was work to do that required proximity to the stove, and then the draw caught and the smoke reversed and went up instead of sideways, and the fire settled into the specific sound of a well-fed fire in a good stove, a low, steady burn rather than the crackling urgency of an inadequately controlled one. The warmth reached the room within 20 minutes. It reached the corners within an hour. Harold worked on the floor while the cabin warmed, beginning at the east wall, where the damage was worst. He had found the hand tools in the cellar arranged in the order of a person who had thought carefully about which task preceded which, and he selected them with the ease of a man who had spent his working life reading the language of tools, understanding that the adze was for shaping and the draw knife was for finishing, and the chisels were for the joinery that would hold the new boards to the old supports once the rotted sections were removed. He worked sitting down, which was his adaptation to the cardiac restriction, and he worked with the particular economy of motion of a man who had learned long ago that doing something correctly the first time was not a form of perfectionism, but a form of efficiency. Ruth worked on the roof from inside. The collapsed section had come down along a single rafter line, which meant the structural failure was localized rather than systemic. The rafter had rotted at its connection point with the ridge beam, and the section of roof it had supported had followed it down. The cellar contained 2 lengths of timber that were close to the right dimension, and the problem was not material availability, but the geometry of getting them into position without a ladder long enough to reach the ridge beam from the inside. Ruth solved this by building a temporary support structure from the shelving lumber and the remaining cellar timber, wedging it against the floor and the wall to create a brace, and shimming the new rafter into place against the ridge beam, with a technique she had learned from watching Harold do a similar repair on their barn roof in 1988, and had filed in the part of her memory reserved for useful practical knowledge. It took 4 hours. When she was finished, the roof was not beautiful, but it was sound, and sound was what this particular moment required. On the 3rd day, with the stove running reliably and the room holding heat above 50 degrees, with the kerosene lamp filled and burning cleanly on the shelf, they read the journal. Harold sat in the wooden chair Ruth had moved to the warmest corner of the room. Cooper lay at the edge of the lamplight. Ruth read aloud. Clara Whitmore had begun the journal in November of 1924, the year after her husband James died in a shaft collapse at the Silver Creek mine. She had not started writing immediately. The early entries suggested she had been recording events retrospectively, filling in the months between James's death and the journal's first page from memory, using the act of writing to impose a sequence on events that had not felt sequential while she lived through them. She wrote in the straight, economical prose of someone who had learned to write as a practical skill rather than a creative one. She did not editorialize. She reported. She had stayed because the land was paid for, and the alternative was her sister's house in Pueblo, where there were 3 children already, and a husband who was kind but strained, and a bedroom that would have been divided from the others by a curtain rather than a wall. Clara did not write that the mountain suited her. She wrote that the alternatives did not suit her, which Ruth recognized as a different statement with similar practical outcomes. The cellar had taken her 2 summers to build. She had learned dry stack construction by reading a manual she had borrowed from the assay office and had practiced on small structures before committing to the full excavation. She described a failed first attempt in detail, analyzing what had gone wrong with the alignment and correcting it in her 3rd attempt rather than her 2nd, because the 2nd attempt she had used to test a different hypothesis about the foundation depth. Ruth listened to this and understood in the specific way that one methodical person recognized another across a century that this was not a woman who had survived by luck or by charm or by the intervention of a benevolent universe. Clara Whitmore had survived by paying attention and refusing to repeat a mistake before she understood its mechanism. The hot spring was mentioned in March of 1925. Clara had found it following a dog, a border collie she referred to throughout the journal as Boone, whose descriptions matched Cooper with the specificity that made Harold set down his cup and look at Ruth when she read those sections aloud. Boone had black and silver coloring. One eye, Clara noted in an aside that was as close to wonder as her prose ever approached, was brown and one was blue. He had come to the claim as a stray the winter before James died and had stayed with Clara after, and Clara treated his judgment with the same practical respect she gave to any source of accurate information about the mountain. The respiratory benefit of the spring was not a theory for Clara. It was an observation documented across multiple winters with the kind of longitudinal noting of symptoms and responses that suggested a mind that understood the difference between a single data point and a pattern. Her lungs, she had what she called winter tightness, a term Ruth recognized as the lay description of exercise-induced bronchospasm, common in mountain climates, improved measurably each year. She used the spring regularly. She tracked this against winters when weather prevented regular access and confirmed the correlation. She did not know the mechanism. She did not need to know the mechanism to use the observation. The last section of the journal was dated September 1931. Clara was leaving not in defeat, but in the planned way that a person left a place they had prepared for the next occupant. She was going to Albuquerque to live near a niece. She was 71 years old and had decided that the specific loneliness of altitude, which she had found manageable for 7 years, had reached the limit of what was manageable. She wrote this without self-pity and without apology. She had done what she had come to do. She had prepared the place for whoever came after, because that was what you did with a good thing. You left it in better condition than you found it, and you trusted that someone else would eventually have the sense to use it. The last line in the journal was about Boone. She had given him to a rancher in the valley whose working dog had died, and she wrote that the rancher had 4 young children and that Boone would be better occupied than he had been in her solitary cabin. She noted that Boone had produced 1 litter, that she had kept 1 puppy from the litter and given it to the rancher along with the father, and that the rancher was a good man who would take care of the line. Ruth closed the journal. The fire had burned down to coals and needed a log. She added 1 and watched the coals accept it and bring it slowly to full burn, and she sat with the journal in her lap and looked at the ceiling of the cabin, which was sound now above the repaired section, and showed the close-grained wood of its original construction in the lamplight. Harold's voice came after a while. She was 71 when she left. Ruth set the journal on the shelf they had cleared for it between the kerosene lamp and the window. She was 71 when she decided she'd done enough alone. That's not the same thing as leaving. The distinction settled into the room and stayed there. Dr. Nora Briggs arrived on a Thursday in the 2nd week of November, appearing on the road above the hollow on a sorrel horse that moved through the thin snow with the calm, ground-covering stride of an animal that had spent years on mountain terrain. She was 57 years old, lean and deliberate in her movements, carrying the specific physical economy of a person who traveled long distances regularly and had learned to spend only the energy a task actually required. She carried her medical bag in a canvas saddlebag, and her manner was the manner of someone who had been providing medical care in remote places long enough to have stopped being surprised by what she found. Daniel had sent her. Ruth learned this within the first 5 minutes, not because Dr. Briggs offered it, but because Ruth asked directly, and Dr. Briggs was the kind of person who answered direct questions without intermediary comfort. Daniel had called the county health office 10 days after his parents' departure, and the health office had routed the inquiry to Dr. Briggs, who was the mobile physician for this section of the Rockies. She had confirmed the location through the property records and had come as soon as her rotation allowed. She examined Harold first standing beside the chair while he sat in it, running through the assessment with the quick competence of a doctor who had conducted 1,000 field examinations and could extract maximum information from minimum contact. His blood pressure was elevated, but not critically. His heart rhythm was present and manageable. She adjusted one of his medications slightly, substituting a lower altitude formulation for one that had been calibrated for Denver's elevation, and told him to walk only on level ground for the next week and to come off the level ground only after that week showed no recurrence of the irregularity Ruth had observed. She listened to Ruth's lungs for a long time. She had Ruth breathe in stages, baseline deep forced, and she noted the readings on a small spirometer she produced from the bag, and she compared them against the last recorded values from Ruth's Denver pulmonologist, whose notes she had obtained from the county health network. She looked at the comparison for a moment without speaking. Ruth watched her look at it. The numbers are better. Dr. Briggs set the spirometer on the table. By a margin I wouldn't have predicted from altitude alone. The elevation should have made your readings worse before it made them better, if it made them better at all. She looked at the stove, the cabin walls, the window facing the slope above. Is there a thermal water source nearby? Ruth told her about the pool. She described the steam, the mineral composition as best she could characterize it, from smell and appearance, the frequency of her use over the past 12 days. Dr. Briggs listened with the focused patience of a scientist receiving unexpected data. Her response was not dismissive and it was not credulous. It was calibrated. Sulfur bicarbonate springs at this elevation, she explained, produced steam with a specific humidity and mineral load that acted on compromised airways in a way that was consistent with established pulmonary physiology. The magnesium component relaxed smooth muscle in the bronchial walls. The warmth and humidity reduced the viscosity of the mucus layer that was one of COPD's primary mechanical obstacles. The combination produced measurable short-term improvement in forced expiratory volume, and with regular therapeutic use, the cumulative reduction in inflammatory stress could produce more lasting changes in baseline function. There were mountain communities in New Mexico and Colorado where this kind of hydrotherapy had been used in the sanatorium era with documented outcomes. She paused at the end of this explanation and looked at Ruth with the level assessment of a scientist who had just confirmed something she had expected to be complicated and found it straightforward. Use it every morning, 30 minutes minimum. If your readings at my next visit show continued improvement, I'll add a formal recommendation to your file. Ruth accepted this with the same practicality with which she had accepted every useful piece of information. In her 82 years, she filed it and incorporated it into the daily plan and moved on. She was already doing the thing. Having the mechanism confirmed was useful. It was not the point. Dr. Briggs stayed for 2 hours and left with the specific directness of a woman who had 7 other remote properties on her rotation and was already calculating the next approach. Before she went, she looked around the cabin, the repaired roof, the functional stove, the organized cellar inventory, the cleared and swept floor, and she said with the measured delivery of a person who did not offer unearned assessments, "I've seen people arrive at worse places with more resources and accomplish less." Ruth walked her to the horse and watched her go and came back to the cabin and started dinner. The first snow of consequence came in mid-November. It began at night, the quiet beginning of a storm that announced itself not with the theatrical build of a front-range system, but with a simple accumulation inch by inch each hour of the night, adding to the previous hour's deposit until morning, revealed a hollow that had been reorganized by the same 8 inches of white into a different landscape entirely. The creek was muted. The cabin's outline was softened. The path to the pool was gone under uniform white and would need to be reestablished. Ruth was up at first light to reestablish it. She used the flat back of a shovel to pack the snow down rather than removing it, creating a firm surface that was slower to reaccumulate than a cleared path and less slippery than bare ground. She worked systematically from the cabin door to the base of the slope, and then up the slope to the granite bench, and Cooper walked the finished path behind her as she went reading its surface, and she thought approving it. The chimney problem came in December. Not a failure, more a communication. The mortar between the upper courses of stone had been compromised by freeze-thaw cycling over more winters than anyone had maintained it, and a section at the 4th course showed a hairline crack that was moving slowly toward the kind of failure that would either admit water or separate the upper chimney from the lower. Ruth found this on a Sunday morning by observing a line of soot on the exterior stones that had not been there the week before, which meant combustion gases were finding a path they were not supposed to find. She could not remortar the exterior joint from a ladder in December at this altitude. She solved it differently using the flat granite pieces from the spring area, which had survived thermal cycling for longer than any mortar she could mix, fitted into the exterior crack with the dry stack logic she had learned from Clara's journal, and shored in place with the hydraulic mortar she had found in the cellar that was intended precisely for this application in wet or cold conditions. It was not a permanent repair. It was a seasoned solution, which was what December required of her. Harold solved the water problem. In mid-December, the temperature dropped far enough for long enough that the section of creek closest to the cabin's water access point froze solid at the surface and became unreliable as a daily source. Harold had been reading Clara's journal, rereading it more precisely in the careful way he read things he wanted to fully absorb, and he had found a passage in which she described a secondary water access point higher on the slope fed by the same subterranean flow that fed the hot spring. The spring's outflow, she wrote, ran beneath the granite bench and emerged lower on the slope in a seep that she had channeled into a small, stone-lined basin. Harold located the basin under the snow by following the logic of the terrain rather than looking for visible signs, and the seep was running, as Clara had described, unfrozen because of its connection to the geothermal source deeper in the rock. He cleared it and lined the access channel with stones from the cellar supply and connected it to a length of copper pipe he found coiled behind the back shelves, and the water that came from it was warm enough to stay liquid through all but the most extreme nights and required only a short morning clearing to stay functional. Ruth watched him finish this work from the cabin door. He moved with the precision of a man who had spent decades joining materials under difficult conditions and understood that the first requirement of any repair was not strength, but fit that things held together because they were properly aligned, not because they were forced. His hands on the copper pipe and the stone surround were the hands that had known this for 50 years, and watching them work in the winter light, she felt the specific kind of love that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the knowledge that this particular person, in the full complexity of who they were, was exactly who this situation required. One evening in late December, after the dinner, things were cleared and the fire was running at the low, steady level, appropriate for the overnight hours. Harold sat in his chair, and Ruth sat across from him with Clara's journal on the shelf between them and Cooper at her feet, and Harold reached across the small table and put his hand over hers. He asked if she had regrets. Ruth looked at him across the table, the lined face, the large scarred hands, the eyes that had spent 50 years looking at her with the direct, uncomplicated regard of a man who had decided exactly what he thought and felt and had no particular interest in performing something different. She thought about what regret meant precisely as a concept, not wishing for a different past, which was merely nostalgia, but active unhappiness with the choices that had led here, with the specific texture of this room and this cold and this life. Her answer came out of something real, rather than something assembled for the occasion. I regret that I didn't ask Clara's story from your father before he died. I regret that I didn't ask you more questions when you were the age when the answers were different. She paused. I don't regret being here. Harold looked at her hand under his. I built you 2 houses now. One they took, one we built back. Ruth turned her hand over beneath his and gripped it. You built me the second one when you were 74 years old with the heart that was supposed to keep you in a rocking chair. She looked at him. I think that's the better house. He said nothing, but the lines around his eyes moved in the way they moved when something had landed exactly where it was meant to, and he did not let go of her hand, and outside the snow fell steadily in the dark on the hollow that was no longer simply empty ground. The letter from Margaret arrived in January. Dr. Briggs brought it on her second visit, handed it to Ruth along with a refill of Harold's cardiac medication and a bag of dried fruit that she noted was from her own kitchen, with the brevity of a person who did not want thanks for the gesture. The letter was 4 sentences written in Margaret's round, still slightly childlike handwriting. She had been thinking about them. She hoped the winter was manageable. She had a question, and she did not know if it was welcome. Could she send something useful? Ruth wrote back the same day. The reply was 2 sentences. The question was welcome. High-altitude vegetable seeds, if Margaret could find them. In February, a small parcel arrived again via Dr. Briggs, wrapped in brown paper and tied with kitchen twine. Inside were seed packets, 12 of them, each labeled in a different hand from Margaret's, which meant she had found them through research rather than simply buying whatever the garden center offered. The labels specified germination temperatures and days to maturity and altitude ranges, and the altitude ranges began at 7,000 feet, which was exactly what this hollow required. At the bottom of the parcel was a folded note, a single sentence, this time in Margaret's handwriting. The woman at the seed store said kale and chard were the most forgiving. Ruth set the note on the shelf beside Clara's journal. She looked at them together for a moment. The careful record of a woman who had survived alone on this mountain, and the careful consideration of a daughter who was beginning in the limited way that first steps were limited, to ask what she could do instead of assuming the answer was nothing. It was not reconciliation. Ruth was too precise a thinker to call it that. It was the first specific action taken by one of her children that was oriented toward her actual circumstances, rather than toward the management of the child's own discomfort about those circumstances. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between sympathy, which observed suffering from a distance, and attention, which moved toward it to understand it. She planted nothing in February. The ground was frozen solid under 2 feet of snow and would remain that way until April. But she cleared a section of the south-facing slope below the cabin where the snow depth was smallest and the rock outcroppings collected afternoon heat, and she began turning the thin soil under the snow in the places she would plant, adding the composted material she had been accumulating in a corner of the cellar since November, preparing a ground that would be ready when the season was ready. Cooper began each morning at the cellar and ended each evening at the door of the cabin, and in between he moved through the hollow with the steady purposefulness of an animal that understood its responsibilities and took them seriously, less like a dog at leisure and more like a foreman who had memorized the floor plan and was checking each station in sequence. In March, the snow began to thin at the hollow's edges. Not dramatically, the mountain released winter in increments grudgingly, as though each degree of warming were a concession made under protest. But the south-facing slope cleared first. In the south-facing slope was where Ruth had turned the soil, and the cleared soil showed dark and rich against the retreating white. The creek, which had been running low and quiet under its ice cover all winter, began to speak again at its banks, where the melt was arriving from the ridges above. Ruth was standing at the edge of that slope on a morning in the third week of March, looking at the soil she had prepared and making a planning calendar in her head when Cooper moved past her to the road above the hollow and stood there. He did not sit. He did not patrol. He stood in the specific posture she had learned to recognize: weight forward, ears tracking tail level rather than raised or lowered. That meant he was processing a specific incoming stimulus that had not yet resolved into a category. Ruth turned from the garden plot and walked up to where the dog stood and looked down the road that descended from the hollow toward the lower elevations. In the morning light, perhaps half a mile below, she could see the dust of a vehicle moving upward through the switchbacks. A large vehicle, dark-colored, moving with the careful pace of something heavy and well-powered. Not Dr. Briggs' horse, not any regular visitor to this hollow, which had in its entire winter of occupation produced no regular visitors. Cooper's tail, which had been level, stayed level. Not hostility, not welcome. The dog was reading information and withholding his assessment, which was a thing he did only when the information was genuinely ambiguous. Harold came to the cabin doorway behind her. She heard the door and then his footsteps on the porch she had replanked in January. She heard him stop when he saw what she was watching. His voice, when it came, was careful and neutral in the way that voices went careful when they were managing the space between what was known and what was suspected. Someone from town. Ruth looked at the vehicle working its way up the switchbacks. It was not the truck from the hardware store. It was not anything from the town below. It was the kind of vehicle that cost more money than anyone in this county drove for farm or ranch work, and it was moving with the deliberate patience of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had calculated how long it would take and had decided the calculation was acceptable. Cooper turned his head and looked at Ruth with both eyes, the brown and the blue, and she could not explain what passed between them in that 3-second exchange. She was a woman of science and would not have tried to explain it, but what she felt in the wake of it was not fear and not surprise, but the particular steadiness that came to her when a situation she had anticipated was finally arriving. She did not go inside. She did not call Robert's name down the hill, though she was nearly certain that was the name she would have used. She stood on the road above the hollow in the March light, with her dog beside her and her husband behind her, and the garden she had prepared through a full Colorado winter at her back, and she waited for the dust to resolve itself into a shape she recognized. The vehicle turned the last switchback and came into view on the final approach to the hollow, and the morning light caught it fully, and Ruth looked at it with the steady and specific attention of a woman who had spent a winter being underestimated and was not inclined to extend that arrangement into the spring. The vehicle was a dark green SUV late model, the kind that came with tinted rear windows and all-terrain tires that had never actually been used for terrain. It pulled into the hollow and stopped 30 feet from where Ruth stood, and the engine cut, and there was a moment of stillness before the driver's door opened. Robert stepped out in jeans and a canvas work jacket that was new enough that the canvas had not yet softened into the shape of the body wearing it. He was trying, Ruth noted, to look like a man who had come for practical reasons rather than business ones. The jacket was the argument he was making before he opened his mouth. Cooper did not move from beside her. The dog's assessment had not changed: weight forward, ears tracking tail level. The posture of a creature that had rendered a preliminary judgment and was waiting for evidence sufficient to revise it. Robert walked to within 10 feet and stopped. He looked at the hollow, the repaired cabin, the stone path to the slope, the cleared garden plot on the south-facing grade, the smoke from the chimney that meant the stove was running well. She watched him process it. Whatever he had expected to find, this was not it, and the gap between expectation and evidence produced a brief, controlled recalibration in his expression that he did not entirely manage to conceal. He met her eyes. "You've done a lot of work here." Ruth let the observation stand without responding to it. She had learned in 30 years of nursing that the first thing a person said was rarely the thing they had come to say, and the fastest route to the actual conversation was to leave the entrance cleared of traffic. Robert moved through it. "I wanted to talk to you about the property, about what it might mean for you going forward." He reached into the canvas jacket and produced a folder, not the leather folder from October, but a manila folder thinner oriented toward a specific document rather than a full presentation. A development group out of Denver has been looking at this section of the Rockies for thermal spa properties. Springs clean air elevation. They've approached several landowners in the area. He held the folder out toward her. "The number they're offering for a mineral rights lease is significant. You and Dad could live comfortably for the rest of your lives. Real comfort. Not," his eyes moved briefly to the cabin, "not this." Ruth looked at the folder in his extended hand. She did not take it. She stood in the March light with her hands at her sides. In the specific stillness she brought to situations that required her to think clearly rather than respond quickly. Her voice when she used it was low and even. "When did they approach you?" Robert's hand holding the folder did not move, but something behind his eyes shifted by a fraction. Ruth continued, "The development group, when did they approach you about this property specifically?" She paused. "Because a group looking at thermal spring sites in this section of the Rockies would need to know which properties had documented spring activity. That information isn't in the public mineral records unless someone who knew about this property told them what to look for." The folder came down slowly. Robert set it against his leg. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice at Robert since he was 15 years old and had lied to her about where he had been on a Friday night, and she had not needed to raise it then either because the specific quality of her attention at full deployment was more pressurizing than volume. "You gave us those keys in October because you had already been in conversation with this group. You knew the springs were here. You knew Clara's claim was not part of the mortgage property, which meant the only way to access the mineral rights was through your father, and the cleanest way to manage your father was through us not surviving the winter." Robert said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That isn't—" He stopped. He began again. "I didn't think you wouldn't survive." Ruth looked at him steadily. "No, you thought it was a reasonable risk. That if you were wrong and we managed, you'd have time to come back with a contract. And if you were right, the property reverted through the estate and you'd be the executor." She paused. "That's not malice, Robert. That's math. And I've known for 20 years that you were a man who trusted his math more than his judgment." He was silent. The wind moved through the pines above the hollow, and the creek made its steady sound, and Cooper breathed beside Ruth's leg with the calm of an animal that had been present for this conversation in some form before and had already determined its outcome. Ruth took the folder from his hand. She opened it and looked at the document inside a one-page summary of terms, a lease structure, a dollar figure that was in fact significant. She read every line. She was thorough and she was fast, and when she had finished, she closed the folder and handed it back. Her voice carried something colder than anger and more durable. "You don't have the standing to bring this offer. This property passes through your father, and your father is alive and in that cabin, and he has not asked you to manage anything on his behalf." She took a breath, the steady, controlled breath of the pool's training, the breath that went all the way down. "But that's the legal answer. You came here for a different answer." Robert looked at her. For the first time since October, since the day with the muddy yard and the canvas jacket that had belonged to someone older and more certain of himself, he looked at her with something in his face that was not calculation. It was the face of a 53-year-old man standing in front of his 72-year-old mother and discovering that the distance between those two ages was not the distance he had measured it to be. Ruth gave him the answer she had decided on during the long walk back down from the spring this morning, before she had seen the vehicle, before she had confirmed the shape of the conversation. "Go home. Come back when you're carrying something other than a contract." He stood in the hollow for a moment longer. Then he got into the vehicle and drove back down the road, and the dust settled behind him. And Cooper watched him go and then turned and walked back to the cabin door and sat down facing the interior, which was the posture he adopted when he had decided the immediate perimeter was secure and the relevant action had moved inside. Harold was at the table when Ruth came in. He had the quiet look of a man who had heard the exchange from the window and was waiting for his wife to tell him what she needed him to understand. She sat across from him and told him about the development company and the mineral rights and the specific logic of what Robert had done and had intended to do. Harold listened to all of it without interrupting, which was the gift he gave her in important conversations, the full length of the silence she needed to render the thing correctly. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then what do you want to do about it? Ruth looked at her hands on the table, the swollen knuckles, the calloused palms. These hands had done everything this place had asked of them through a full Colorado winter, and they had done it with the tools that a woman dead since 1931 had thought to leave behind for exactly this purpose. I want to protect the spring, legally, so that no development company and no well-meaning son can touch it. Harold nodded once slowly. Catherine. It was not a question and it was not a suggestion. It was two people arriving at the same conclusion by different routes and recognizing the meeting point. Ruth wrote the letter to Catherine that evening. She was brief and specific. There was a legal situation requiring attention. The mineral rights on the Silver Creek property needed to be placed in a protective structure that Catherine, as an attorney, would be able to design. If Catherine was interested in that work, she was welcome to come. The letter did not contain an apology or a softening. It contained a task and an invitation, which was Ruth's language for the opening of something. Margaret came in April, 6 days after the last of the heavy snow cleared from the hollow's lower ground. She arrived in her own car alone with a duffel bag and the slightly overbright expression of a person managing a level of anxiety through forward motion. She stood in the clearing and looked at the cabin in the garden plot, in the stone path, and her expression changed from managed to genuine, the shift that happened when a person arrived expecting one thing and found that the reality had its own logic that made the preparation unnecessary. Ruth handed her a pair of work gloves. She did not greet her daughter with words that referenced the months that had passed or the events of October. She handed her the gloves and pointed at the garden plot and began explaining what was planted where and what still needed to go in the ground. Margaret put the gloves on without comment and followed Ruth to the plot and crouched in the soil without flinching, and Ruth noted this without remarking on it. They worked side by side for 3 hours that first morning. The work was quiet in the way that outdoor physical work was quiet, not empty, but occupied by the sounds of the task and the sounds of the place and the gradual settling of two people into the rhythm of doing something together. Margaret had questions about the seeds, and Ruth answered them precisely. Margaret made observations about the soil, and Ruth confirmed or corrected them, and the dynamic that developed between them was not the dynamic of a daughter returning to her mother's judgment, but of a student arriving at a subject she had not previously taken seriously and discovering that the subject had depth. In the afternoon of the second day, Margaret was staking the taller plants against wind while Ruth prepared the next row, and Margaret said without looking up from the stake she was pressing into the soil, "Robert told us you'd probably be gone by December." She paused. He didn't say it directly. He said the winter up there was very hard for people your age. He said it as a fact, not a wish, but we understood what he meant. Ruth continued preparing the row. "And what did you do with that understanding?" Margaret pushed the stake the rest of the way in. Daniel asked if we should go up. Robert said it would only cause problems. Catherine said you had made your choice. She looked up then. I sent the letter. Ruth did not respond immediately. She worked the soil with the hand fork for a moment, turning the next section to the depth the seeds required. Then the letter mattered. She did not expand on it. She did not make it larger than it was, which would have been a form of condescension. She let it sit at its actual size, which was the size of the first step in a long walk, which was the only size a first step could honestly be. Margaret cried that evening briefly near the end of dinner, the way she cried when something real arrived, before she had prepared the appropriate emotional management for it. Ruth let it happen and did not comfort it into a smaller shape than it needed to be. When Margaret had finished, Ruth refilled her cup and said, "Your grandmother, my mother cried in this same efficient way." She kept it short and went back to what she was doing. I always thought it was the most functional approach. Margaret looked at her across the table with a wet face and something in her expression that was recognition mixed with something that might have been relief. The relief of a person who has spent years believing they are too emotional and is being told by someone they respect that the emotion itself was never the problem, only the use being made of it. Daniel came in May on a Tuesday without notice, appearing at the Hollows Upper Road on foot after leaving his truck at the lower pull-off because the road had been soft with spring thaw and he had not wanted to risk it. He came in carrying nothing but a jacket and a silence that was different from the silence he had worn in October. That one had been the silence of avoidance of a man constructing distance between himself and an accountability he was not prepared to meet. This silence was the silence of someone who had been having a private conversation with himself for 7 months and had arrived at something he needed to say aloud to make it final. Harold gave him the job of replacing the remaining compromised floorboards in the cabin's east corner, a job that required patience and precision and several days of sustained attention. Harold sat nearby and worked on a wooden storage bench while Daniel worked the floor, and they were companionable in the way that men who were not yet ready to speak directly to each other were companionable through shared tasks, the conversation happening at the level of the work, rather than at the level of words. On the third day, Daniel stopped and looked at Harold's hands moving over the bench joinery. "I know what I cost you." His voice was flat and direct, the voice of someone reading from an internal document they had memorized and were now delivering rather than composing. "Not just the money, the energy you spent managing it. The decisions you didn't make for yourselves because you were managing the decisions I made badly." Harold set down the plane he was using. He looked at his son for a long time with the measured assessment of a man who had been waiting for this particular sentence for years and wanted to receive it correctly now that it had arrived. His response came slowly from somewhere genuine. "You know why you kept going back to the gambling?" Daniel looked at the floor he had been replacing. "Because I was bad with money." Harold shook his head once. "Because you were afraid of quiet." He picked up the plane again. "I worked next to loud machinery for 30 years because quiet made me hear things I wasn't ready to hear. I called that a work ethic. Your mother called it accurate." He ran the plane once along the edge of the benchboard. "What you called gambling, I would have called the same impulse with a different price." The floorboard went in that afternoon and Daniel held it while Harold made the final connections, and the floor was level and sound, and the east corner was no longer the dangerous zone it had been when they arrived in October. Ruth stood in the doorway and looked at the finished section and at her husband and her son working at its edges, and she stored the image in the same place she stored all the images that had accumulated over a winter of doing things she had not known she would need to do. Catherine arrived in early June with a car full of legal documents and the focused expression of an attorney who had been working a problem for 3 months and had reached the point in the work where the solution was visible and required only execution. She was 49 and had her mother's posture and her father's hands, and she stood in the hollow in the June sun and looked at what her parents had built here with an expression that passed through professional assessment into something less managed. She spread the documents on the table in the cabin and walked Ruth and Harold through them with the efficiency of a person who had translated complex legal structure into plain language so many times that the translation was automatic. The structure she had designed placed the Silver Creek property, including all mineral rights and water rights, into an irrevocable trust with Harold and Ruth as lifetime beneficiaries. Upon their deaths, the trust passed to a conservation organization with specific management conditions that prohibited commercial development of the thermal spring. No mining company, no spa developer, no well-capitalized son with a manila folder could penetrate the structure she had built around this ground. Ruth read every page. She asked 3 questions, each of which went to the specific mechanisms that would hold under the kinds of pressure she had already encountered. Catherine answered them without impatience, which told Ruth that the answers had been anticipated, that Catherine had built the structure by imagining the precise objections her mother would raise. When the signing was done and the documents were stacked and Catherine was putting them back in order, Ruth poured coffee and set a cup in front of her daughter. Catherine looked at the cup for a moment before she picked it up. Her voice when she used it came from somewhere below the professional register. "I want to say something that I'm not sure comes out right." Ruth waited. Catherine held the cup with both hands. "The papers I brought to the house in October. I had drafted them 2 weeks before. I had drafted them, and I had not told you because I told myself, I believed that it was the efficient approach, that presenting them as done was cleaner than presenting them as a decision. She looked at the surface of the coffee. I've thought about that word a lot this winter. Efficient. I think I used it for years to mean something else. Ruth looked at her daughter. She thought about a girl who had been 7 years old and had organized her school papers into a filing system that the teacher had found both impressive and slightly unnerving because the teacher had understood correctly that the organization was less about the papers than about the need to have something in order when other things were not. You used it to mean safe, Ruth said. Catherine was quiet, and she looked up from the coffee. I'm sorry for October. She said it simply without the legal structure she usually brought to statements of consequence. It was a sentence in the shape a sentence took when the person speaking it had stripped everything away from it except the meaning. Ruth looked at her daughter, the 49-year-old woman with the files and the careful competence and the 7-year-old's filing system underneath it, and felt the particular weight of knowing a person across the full length of their becoming. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Catherine's, and then she took her hand back and picked up her own coffee because this was how Ruth communicated a contact made, acknowledged, released, not withheld and not prolonged, given in the right measure. The documents were filed at the county courthouse the following week, and the property at Silver Creek Hollow became in the legal sense what it had already become, in every other sense a place that was going to remain what it was. Robert came back in July, not with a vehicle this time on foot from the lower pull-off, the same approach Daniel had used in May, arriving at the hollow's edge in the late afternoon when the light came through the pines at the long horizontal angle that made the hollow's colors deepen and the creek below catch individual gleams. He was wearing work clothes that had actually been worked in, not the performance of a canvas jacket, but the genuine article jeans, with a worn left knee and boots that had taken on the color of mountain soil. Ruth was on the porch. She watched him come up the road, and she watched Cooper, who was also on the porch, and Cooper looked at Robert for a long moment, and then stood up from his position and walked to the edge of the porch steps and sat there, not blocking, not welcoming, simply present at the threshold. The same posture the dog had held in October outside the repossessed house when he was holding the line between what was outside and what mattered inside, except that the line had moved. Ruth did not go inside, and she did not step forward. She let Robert come to the porch and stand below it. He did not open with anything. He stood in the hollow light and looked at the garden along the south slope, and the stone path, and the smoke from the stovepipe, and the two chairs on the porch, and the dog at the steps, and his mother in one of the chairs, and he appeared to be doing the same arithmetic he had done in March, but with different variables and arriving at a different sum. Ruth spoke first. Cooper is deciding. Robert looked at the dog. Deciding what? Whether you're here for a reason he respects. She kept her voice level. He's been right about that question every time I've seen him consider it. Robert was quiet for a moment. Then he sat down on the bottom step of the porch in the dirt at Cooper's level, rather than standing at her eye level, and this was either calculated or it was instinct, and she did not yet know which. Cooper looked at him from a distance of 14 inches. Robert did not reach for the dog. He waited. Cooper looked at Ruth, then he looked back at Robert. Then he stepped down from the porch step and circled Robert once, a careful circuit at a consistent radius, reading what the dog read in the specific chemistry of a person's presence, the information that resided in the body below the level of the face. He completed the circle and sat beside Robert, not pressed against him the way he sat against Harold, beside, at the range of a colleague rather than a companion. Ruth looked at this. She thought about what it meant and what it did not mean, and she answered the question Robert had not asked yet. Sit anywhere, I'll get coffee. He sat on the steps, and she brought 2 cups out and handed him one and sat back in her chair. The afternoon moved around them in its late July way, the creek audible, the hawk audible above the east ridge, the specific warmth of this altitude summer that was nothing like the flat pressing heat of the plains, but something more like permission than warmth, as though the mountain was allowing a brief season to exist here before resuming its primary identity. Robert held the cup. His voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who had gotten where he was going by the most indirect route available and had arrived with fewer certainties than he had started with, I told myself the development deal was for you, that the money would solve the problem. He looked at the garden plot. I knew that wasn't entirely true, but I had enough of the story to keep telling it. Ruth did not help him with the next part. She had learned in decades of nursing that the people who most needed to find a thing themselves were damaged by being handed it because the handling removed the effort that made the finding mean something. He continued, Daniel told me about the conversation with Dad, about the quiet. He looked at his coffee. Robert, when did you last sit in a room without looking at your phone? He was quoting someone she recognized the cadence and she realized it was himself. He was quoting a question he had put to himself in the months between March and now and had been living inside. I climbed on the roof of the house on Garfield Street when I was 8. You probably knew. Ruth looked at him. I knew. He blinked once. You never said anything. She considered how to render this accurately. I knew why you did it. I knew the house was loud that winter. I decided that a child who was managing the situation by going up instead of in was making better decisions than I had given him a way to make inside, and the correct intervention was to give him a better way inside, and I failed to do that. She paused. I have regrets about it. That one is specific. Robert turned the cup in his hands. He did not look at her while he absorbed this. He looked at the mountains above the eastern ridge, the snowfields still white on the highest faces in July, the specific distance of them. His voice was quieter when it returned. I don't know how to be in this family the way Margaret is, or Daniel is becoming. I know how to solve problems. I know how to structure things. He paused. I don't know how to just be here. Ruth looked at her son, the 53-year-old man who was still in the specific way that human development worked, partly the 8-year-old on the roof looking for a vantage point from which the situation was manageable. She felt something shift in her chest, not the dramatic shift of forgiveness rendered as an event, but the slow structural shift of a position held too long being carefully released. Her voice carried something she rarely gave directly. Being here is exactly what here requires. Nothing more specific than that. He stayed 3 days. He helped Harold with a section of the north fence that had come down under a fallen pine in the spring, which was a job that required sustained effort at a steady pace and offered no opportunity for the kind of rapid problem-solving that was Robert's primary mode of engagement. He worked without rushing it and without making it more complicated than it was. On the last evening, he sat on the porch long after dinner had ended and the light had gone from the hollow, and Cooper lay at his feet fully against his leg, now the contact an animal gave when its assessment had been finalized. Ruth came out and sat in her chair, and Harold joined them, and the three of them were quiet together for a while, the way people were quiet when they were not performing the absence of conversation, but were simply occupied by the same evening. Robert's voice when it came was the voice he had when he was not building toward anything. I'll talk to the development company. Ruth, Catherine's already handled the legal structure. He nodded once. I know, I'll tell them myself, not through documents. He looked at the dark line of the ridge against the sky. It'll be a shorter conversation than they're expecting. Neither she nor Harold responded, but Harold's hand found Ruth's on the armrest between their chairs and rested there. Dr. Briggs came in the 3rd week of August for her quarterly examination. She listened to Ruth's lungs and looked at the spirometer reading and wrote the numbers down and compared them to the readings from the previous 3 visits and looked at Ruth across the table with the expression of a scientist reviewing data that has consistently defied her baseline prediction. The forced expiratory volume was up 11% from the November reading. 11% in a patient with moderate COPD at 72 years old was not a number that appeared in standard case progressions. It was a number that appeared in case studies of patients who had done everything correctly in a setting that provided something the standard treatment protocol could not replicate. She did not call it a cure. She called it a documented response to consistent thermal mineral inhalation therapy combined with reduced environmental particulate load and regular moderate physical activity. She was going to write it up for a regional medical journal, she said, without identifying the location or the patient by name. The data was too useful not to document. Ruth said that was fine. She said it in the tone she used for decisions that had already been made and were being shared as a courtesy rather than a negotiation. It was Daniel who brought Juniper. He arrived the following Saturday morning with his truckos and a cardboard box in the passenger seat that emitted approximately twice per minute, a sound that was not quite a bark and not quite a whine, but occupied the frequency between them with the confidence of a creature who had not yet decided how the world worked, but was quite certain it wanted to find out. Daniel carried the box to the porch with both hands, the expression on his face somewhere between pride and sheepishness, and set it on the boards and opened the flaps. The puppy that came out was 4 months old and hit the porch floor running in 3 directions at once before resolving into a single direction, which turned out to be straight into the side of Ruth's leg, where she stood at the porch's edge. Ruth looked down at the animal that had run into her and felt the specific startlement of encountering something that had come from outside her calculations and landed inside her life anyway. Border Collie. Black and silver, the same distribution of color as Cooper. Not similar, precise. The same proportions of dark and light, the same feathering on the tail, the same slight broadness in the chest that spoke of working stock rather than show breeding. Ruth looked at the dog's eyes and her breath went in and did not come out for a moment. One brown, one blue, the heterochromia that Cooper carried, the heterochromia that Clara Whitmore had noted in Boone in a journal written in 1924 and left in a stone cellar for whoever came next. And on the puppy's forehead, slightly left of center, a white marking in the shape of a star, irregular edge the size of a silver dollar. Ruth had a photograph in the cedar box that had come from the repossessed house. The photograph was of Cooper at 3 years old, taken in the backyard of the house on Garfield Street, and in that photograph, the white star marking on his forehead was precisely the size and position and shape of the marking on this puppy's face. She turned and went inside and came back out with the cedar box and found the photograph and held it beside the puppy that Daniel was now holding up for inspection. Harold came out of the cabin and looked at the photograph and then at the puppy, and then at Cooper, who had come to the edge of the porch and was looking at the puppy with both eyes, the brown and the blue, and the expression, if that word could be applied, of an animal encountering something it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. Daniel's voice came careful and slightly wondering. I found her at a rescue operation out near the Utah border. The woman running it said the dog's litter came from a ranch border collie with bloodlines traced back to working dogs in the Colorado Rockies. She couldn't go further back than the 1970s in the documentation, but she said the line was old. He paused. Something about her made me think of him. I can't explain it better than that. Ruth looked at the photograph and the puppy, and Cooper in the photograph again. Then she opened Clara's journal to the last page, the September 1931 entry, and read aloud the sentence she had read to Harold by lamplight in November, the line about Boone's offspring and the rancher's children and the dog given to someone who would use the line well. She read it in the specific flat tone she used for evidence she was presenting, rather than arguing, letting the words carry their own weight. The silence that followed was the silence of 4 people standing in it and 2 dogs in a morning that had not known it was going to mean this much. Harold set the journal down on the porch railing. He looked at the puppy in Daniel's arms and then at Cooper, at the porch's edge, and he said very quietly in the voice he used for things that did not need emphasis to be large, she found her way back. Ruth put the photograph in the cedar box and put the box down and held out her hands. Daniel passed the puppy to her, and she held it against her chest and looked at its face, the mismatched eyes, the star marking, and felt the particular weight of this small animal in the specific way she had felt the weight of Clara's journal when she first held it in the cellar, not the weight of the physical thing, but of the time and intention it carried. Cooper had not moved from the porch's edge. The puppy from Ruth's arms was looking at the older dog with the alert, electric attention of a young animal encountering a thing it did not have language for but recognized by some deeper register. Ruth set the puppy on the porch boards. The 2 dogs assessed each other across 6 feet of distance. Cooper's tail moved once a slow, single arc. The puppy's tail was a blur of motion, a completely different relationship to the same impulse. Cooper lowered his front end, extending his legs forward and dropping his chest toward the boards, while his back end stayed high. The play bow, the invitation. The posture that across all dog language meant, come forward. This is safe. I am not a threat to you, and you are not a threat to me, and there is room here for both of us to be what we are. The puppy crossed the 6 feet in under a second and ran into Cooper at full speed, and Cooper absorbed it with the patient solidity of an animal that has been certain of itself for 11 years and does not require the world to move more slowly on its account. Margaret came out of the cabin with her coffee and stood in the doorway and watched the two dogs and looked at Ruth. Catherine, who had arrived the day before to drop off the filed trust copies, came up from the path near the garden where she had been taking a morning walk and stood at the clearing's edge and watched. Daniel was on the porch steps, and Robert, who had been at the spring above when Daniel arrived, came back down the slope and stopped at the clearing's edge when he saw the assembled family on and around the porch. Ruth looked around at all of them. She did not make a speech. She was not a person who made speeches, and the moment did not need one. It had its own weight and its own language, and anyone present who needed words to understand what was happening had not been paying sufficient attention to the previous 10 months. She looked down at the two dogs on the porch, the old one with the silver in his black coat, and the eyes that had seen 11 years of a family and a house and a hollow and a winter that was supposed to be the end of something, and the young one with the star on her forehead and the energy of a creature at the beginning of everything. And she said more to herself than to anyone in particular, Juniper. Harold, from the cabin doorway where he had quietly arrived, asked why, the same way he had asked why about everything for 50 years. Not because he couldn't guess, but because he liked hearing how she arrived at things. Ruth looked at the Rocky Mountain juniper trees that grew along the hollow's rim, the ones that were twisted by decades of wind and heavy with the specific persistence of a species that had developed through long evolutionary time, the exact relationship to adversity that allowed it to remain standing when species with more advantages had not. She looked at those trees and then at the puppy, because they outlast everything the mountain throws at them. They don't grow straight, they grow in whatever shape the wind requires, and then the wind stops and they're still there. No one said anything. Cooper lay down on the porch boards with the composed deliberateness of an animal that had accomplished the last item on a long list and was now available for whatever came next. Juniper lay down beside him, pressed against his side, and put her chin on his front leg, and Cooper looked out over the hollow with both eyes, the brown and the blue, at the mountains and the trees and the morning that had come up clear over all of it. August moved around them. The garden produced what the seeds had promised: the kale first, then the chard, then the slower crops that Margaret had added in April from her own supplemental packets mailed up with Dr. Briggs on her May rotation. The table in the cabin held food from this ground most nights now, which was a thing that would have seemed like sentiment in October and was simply logistics in August. On the last evening of August, after the children had come and gone, in the rotation that had established itself through the summer, Margaret's 2-week stay, Daniel's weekend visits, Catherine's monthly documentation check, Robert's quietly increasing presence that had moved from 3 days to a week without either of them counting, Ruth sat on the porch alone. Harold was inside finishing the last bench he was building from the cellar lumber, the fourth one, the one that would go along the north wall and provide seating for the number of people that the cabin now regularly held. The light in the hollow at that hour was the light she had come to know as its specific evening light, a long golden fall from the western gap in the ridgeline that lit the south-facing slope, and the garden and the stone path and the surface of the creek at the hollow's northern edge, and made all of it look for approximately 40 minutes like the set of a memory you hadn't made yet. Cooper lay beside her chair. He was 11 years old and would not be 11 forever, and she held that knowledge in the way she held all irreversible facts clearly, without looking away from it, without making it mean more or less than it meant. He was here now. He was beside her now. The fact of now was not diminished by the fact of later. If anything, the awareness of later made the now more precisely itself. Juniper was at the edge of the porch standing. She had developed in the 4 weeks since her arrival a posture for the evening watch that was recognizably descended from Cooper's own, the weight slightly forward, the ears in independent tracking mode, the tail level. She was not performing it. She had observed it in Cooper so many times that it had become through the specific alchemy of imitation that was how young animals learn from experience once her own. Harold came out and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together in the way the long quiet of 50 years allowed, not the quiet of nothing to say, but the quiet of so much said that the unsaid parts carried their own communication. The words retired now into something more structural, the foundation rather than the house. Harold looked at Juniper at the porch's edge. She's learning to watch, Ruth. She's been watching since the first day. She's just getting better at knowing what she's watching for. The hawk that lived on the east ridge made its evening pass visible for a moment against the last of the direct light, before dropping below the ridgeline. The creek made its sound. Somewhere in the pines above the hollow, an owl announced the transition from day to night in its short declarative way. Ruth looked out at the hollow the cabin Harold had rebuilt board by board, the garden that was producing the stone paths, the spring above the ridge that had done what medicine alone could not do, the cellar that had held through 100 winters, the tools of a woman who had understood what it meant to prepare a place for someone you would never meet. She looked at all of it and felt the weight of it not as a burden, but as the specific ballast that kept a structure from being moved by wind. She had spent a winter being told by every external indicator that her story had ended. The bank's clipboard, the children's closed carriages, the rusted keys dropped into her hand like a final argument. And she had taken the rusted keys and gone up the mountain and found that the mountain had no opinion about endings, that it was simply a place that had been here longer than the category of endings applied, and that what it offered was not comfort, but context. And that context was, in the end, the thing that made the difference between a person who gave up and a person who understood that giving up was never actually one of the options. Harold reached over and put his hand on hers on the armrest. She turned her hand over and held his. Cooper lifted his head once and looked at the darkening road below the hollow, at the place where the trail bent and disappeared toward the world they had come from. He looked at it with the patient, complete attention he gave to all things he was responsible for, and then he turned his head and looked at Juniper at the porch's edge, and something passed between the old dog and the young one, and yet in that look, something that was not a sound and not a gesture, but was a communication. Nonetheless, the kind that moved between animals who were engaged in the same work at different points in the same long continuity of it. Juniper turned her head and looked back at Cooper. Then she turned back to the hollow and resumed her watch, her ears tracking the evening, her young body in the posture she had learned from the oldest and most reliable source available to her. Ruth watched this and held her husband's hand in the last light over Silver Creek Hollow, and understood that the warmest homes were not the ones you built when you had everything you needed, but the ones you built from what remained after everything else had been taken, because those were the ones built with full knowledge of what they had to survive, and that knowledge was what made them last. The stars came out above the ridge. Juniper watched them the way Cooper had watched them on the first night, with the attentiveness of an animal that understood its job was to watch, and that the watching done faithfully through the dark hours was what made the morning possible.